I want to thank Dr. Morrison for his invitation to talk with you today. And I was very happy to share the classes on Tuesday, which gave me a real sense of what this class is about and what it's like. And in particular, his comments, very, very learned comments, I want to say. I was very impressed with his grasp of Wittgenstein, and about whom I think I know something. And also I was very, very enlightened by what he had to say about William James. I've just come from New Hampshire, where I spent Thanksgiving, and that gave me a sense of where William James spent his last years, I think, yeah. A beautiful, beautiful country you have here. Oh my, America is so wonderful. Anyway, speaking of Wittgenstein, who was this man, Maurice O'Connor Drury's teacher, Wittgenstein wasn't terribly impressed by these classes. He says, "My lectures are going well. They will never go better. But what effect do they leave behind? Am I helping anybody? What they, his students, learn is not worth learning. And the personal impression I make does not serve them with anything." That's true for all of them, with perhaps one or two exceptions. So I'm looking around the class now to see who the exceptions are going to be. However, I think it's evident that at least in Wittgenstein's case, in Cambridge University in England, far more than one or two students were deeply affected by his classes. And very prominent among these was Maurice O'Connor Drury. That's a picture of him here. I didn't bring all the equipment, the bells and whistles with you, because at any lecture I've been in Ireland, anyway, in the last couple of years, the pictures broke down. The computers just don't work, and in my age group, I'm just not enough of a tech head to control that. So this Maurice O'Connor Drury is the central figure that I want to discuss with you today. And why Drury here in this class? It's clear that Drury is relevant to medicine and the humanities, HUMS 029. Like most figures discussed in this class, Drury was a physician, he was a doctor. But he wrote a highly regarded book about medical practice from a humanistic perspective. He was an undergraduate student of philosophy at Cambridge University. They didn't call it philosophy at Cambridge, they called it the moral sciences. And he was tutored by Wittgenstein. Drury had originally intended to take orders in the Anglican Church. In America here, that's the Episcopalian community. Rejecting that plan, he aspired to a career teaching philosophy, but was guided by Wittgenstein towards medicine instead. And Wittgenstein continued with a mentoring role towards Drury's medical education in Dublin in the late 1930s, through his early years as a doctor in the British Royal Army Medical Corps during World War II, and he recommended that after the war, Drury should specialize in psychiatry, which Drury did. So this man had a huge influence on his life, on Drury's life. Despite a very busy professional life, Drury persisted in being deeply involved in philosophy, bringing to bear what he had learned from Wittgenstein, in particular to issues that arose in the practice of his psychiatry, and we were going to talk about that. My own involvement in this story is that I've assembled his writings, previously published and unpublished, in this book, the selected writings of Maurice O'Connor Drury. And I think I mentioned to you last day, it's published by the same publisher as Harry Potter. So that's my big claim to fame. The collection justifies considering him alongside the physician writers that are featured in your course, Bulgakov, Henry Marsh, Atul Gawande, and Lisa Sanders of the Yale Medical School. All have or are deploying perspectives informed by the humanities to enrich medical practice. And actually the last day, Dr. Morrison asked me to explain why the humanities. And I think the humanities' role is to foster or take care of your soul. And what do I mean by your soul? The Latin for soul is anima. So it's what animates you, what makes you alive. When you cry, when you smile, when you're with friends, when you're with love. It's your soul. It's so we have soul music. It's a wonderful word. And the humanities foster that. That's what they're there. You read a novel, you read a poem, you listen to music, you take part in a play, you are at play, you dance. That's what the humanity, it's your human, what you can do as a human being and to foster and strengthen that. So Drury understood that humanistic insight, valuable for medical practice, was not confined to his subject, philosophy. And in that doctors, and indeed all of those who have a concern for how medicine is practiced in civil society generally, could gain from reading, I quote from him, the great novelists like Tolstoy, the dramatists, biographers, and historians. The person who brought us here this morning is a theatre director in Rhode Island, Providence, and she's just starting next week on a play called The Faith Healers. And I would absolutely love to be a kind of a gopher with her, you know, seeing how you put a play together. It's extraordinary. Now, it seems to me that this is the thesis that underlies this course, that medicine is the most, think about this is a quotation, the most humanistic of the sciences and the most scientific of the humanities. It straddles, medicine properly practiced is the most humanistic of the sciences and the most scientific of the humanities. As I've already said, the predominant philosophical influence on Drury was Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein is regarded, along with Martin Heidegger, as the most innovative philosophers of the 20th century. And as I become clear to you, Wittgenstein had a profound interest in medicine, and the focus of his interest in medicine was Drury and his career. But also did Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher. Philosophy is kind of divided into two styles of philosophy. The Anglophone philosophy, which is what you would probably mainly get here in any English-speaking country, like England, Ireland, America, Canada, Australia, you know, the former British Empire. But Heidegger also had a huge interest in medicine. He was based in Germany, and he gave rise to what's called phenomenological philosophy. And for 10 years, no, he really did spoil his copybook during the Second World War, because he was he kind of collaborated with the Nazis in the university system. And he said, but he did have this seminar in Switzerland after the war for about 10 years called the Zollikon seminars. And it was mainly for doctors and mainly psychiatrists and philosophers. And one of his quotations, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with him, but he said, blood pressure can be measured, but not life pressures. You can measure your blood pressure. I can do it on my watch. It's probably zooming right now. But not your life pressures, what's really bothering you. Heart functioning can be measured, but not the loss of heart or heartbreak. And he focused on the patient's experience of disease in the form of pain or discomfort, emotional distress and depression. But that in itself is not anything measurable. And of course, science has to do with what's measurable. One cannot measure tears. Measures at best a fluid. But the drops of the fluid are not the tears. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful way of putting it. That's. I'm going to move away from Heidegger, but we could have another talk about the influence of Heidegger on medicine. It's widely accepted that a journal kept by Drury as a student, later published as Conversations with Wittgenstein, has contributed the most compelling picture of Wittgenstein available. He was a magnetic personality. He attracted interest and has attracted interest far outside the confines of professional philosophy. I don't know if you're familiar with the film Dancing at Lunasa, which involves Meryl Streep as playing the main thing. The author of that play originally, Brian Friel, contacted me once to say I would like to write a play about Wittgenstein in Ireland. And of course I was very excited. My 15 moments of fame had arrived. And then he invited me to the famous theatre, the Abbey Theatre in Dublin. And everybody was there, from the president of the country for his new play called Give Me Your Answer Do. I don't know if you know the little song, say, Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer do. Anyway, that was the name play. And I was waiting with bated breath to have him talk about, have the characters talk about Wittgenstein. But the play turned out to be about a playwright who could not write a play about Wittgenstein. So there you are. But Wittgenstein's personality has attracted an enormous amount of interest outside of philosophy. And the standard biography of Wittgenstein by a man called Ray Monk, called Ludwig Wittgenstein, The Duty of Genius, has written that it was Drurys Journal, the Conversations with Wittgenstein, that first stimulated him to imagine a biography of Wittgenstein. What struck Monk was how Drury's accounts contrasted so vividly with the pale shadow of the real man that prevailed in Oxford in the late 1980s. By that time, Wittgenstein was dead 10, 15 years, and Monk was a student of philosophy at the university. And actually, he introduced this book and described how, as a student, he had gone up to London for the weekend. He bought the journals, a copy of Wittgenstein's journals. He said, I read it all the way up on the bus back up to Oxford. And at that moment, I decided to write a biography of Wittgenstein. And this authenticity is found not only in Drury's journal, but also in essays which concentrated on the philosophical problems that arise in psychiatry and psychology, which have been collected in Drury's book. They were originally talks to groups of doctors in Dublin and Swansea in England, in Wales, and he then produced In the Danger of Words. And Monk again wrote that in its tone and its concerns, it was perhaps the most truly Wittgensteinian work published by any of Wittgenstein's students. With all that in mind, I propose to tell you a little more about Drury and his relationship with Wittgenstein, a relationship that lasted from 1931, when he first met him as a student, until Wittgenstein's death in 1951, over 20 years. And now, however, as a preliminary to that account, I think it would be helpful to situate the Wittgenstein-Drury interaction as a relatively modern instance of an interaction between Western philosophy and medicine. And I say Western philosophy and Western medicine because there are also wonderful medicines Chinese medicines and Indian medicines and medicines that are in indigenous communities all over the world. I mean, we have just one version of medicine, but it's the one that in this country, in my own country, predominates. But this goes back a very long way, the interaction between medicine and philosophy and medicine, back to classical Greece. And the famous Christian writer Tertullian said it was like a sisterhood between the two, because one was a quest for truth, philosophy, and the other was a quest for health. But sometimes truth can be understood as critical to health, mental health in particular. So this is why I'm going to bring you a passage illustrating all of this from one of Plato's dialogues, The Laws, and it's in front of you here now. He says, a state's invalids include not only free men but slaves too. As you know, slaves were an integral part of ancient Greece. And the state's invalids who are not free but slaves are always being treated by other slaves who either rush about on flying visits or wait to be consulted in their surgeries. Now, apparently, some people speculate that this may have been written at the time of a plague in Athens. This kind of doctor, the slave doctor, never gives any account of the particular illness of the individual slave, or is prepared to listen to one. He simply prescribes what he thinks best in the light of experience, as if he had precise knowledge and with the self-confidence of a dictator. I'm telling you what to do. Then he dashes off on his way to the next slave patient, and so takes off his master's shoulders some of the work of attending the sick. I don't know if you think this, but this is so contemporary, it's unbelievable. The visits of the free doctor, by contrast, are mostly concerned with treating the illnesses of free men. His method is to construct an empirical case history by consulting the invalid and his friends. In this way, he himself learns something from the sick, and at the same time, he gives the individual patient all the instructions he can. He gives no prescription until he has somehow gained the invalid's consent. Then, coaxing him into continued cooperation, he tries to complete his restoration to health. Now, which of the two methods is best used by the physician or director of bodily regimen, I think is what I should say there. The physical trainer, was very important in ancient Greece, as important as the doctor. So the man who, for example, like a physiotherapist, but somebody who kind of, if you go to a gym and helps you to work yourself out, work out. He said, that which affects the same result by a twofold process, or that which implies a single process, the worst of the two, and exasperates its subject. What that means is the guy who just hands out prescriptions, that's one method. The guy who listens to his patient and examines him correctly, that's another. And you need to do both. Now, as the French say, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Is it not still the case that far too frequently cursory, hasty, and therefore not thorough or detailed or respectful medical care is dispensed to the poor, while the economically endowed demand and get considerate and considered care? And this situation raised the philosophical question that motivated all of Plato's investigations. Can that state of affairs qualify as socially just? While it is true that Plato did not ask, which he should have done, the question about the institution of slavery, I don't think there is more up-to-date or more fundamental question to be asked of society now, And I base this on talking a lot to doctors, to nurses, to occupational therapists, to physiotherapists, all sorts of people. The medical system, certainly in Ireland and also in England, is under tremendous pressure. And the people who get the worst end of the stick are, of course, the economically deprived people. And indeed, as I mentioned last day, an influential group of philosophers, all female, argued in Oxford for the continued importance of values in running society, especially the value of justice and fairness. So I'll just, I think I've talked about them the last day, but they succeeded to introduce a new take on ethics, which argued against the idea that if it feels good for me, well, it's okay. That's it. That's all. That's the end of it. If I feel good about it, okay. What they were saying is it has to be based on certain values, behaviors that contribute to your own goodness, but also to those of others. We do not live as isolated automatons. We live in a social situation, and in that we find our fulfillment. Now you may query how it is that philosophers still draw inspiration from ancient texts, from like Plato's dialogues, which I've just been discussing with you, and indeed what started out as Aristotle's notes about which these female philosophers based themselves. And Drury discussed this practice explicitly in his letters. And he found his answer in the perennial nature of philosophy, and I've got he found the point elaborated in another one of Plato's dialogues, The Republic. And here you see it here. Dialectic, philosophical interrogation, in fact, is the only activity whose method is to challenge its own assumptions, so that it may rest firmly on first principles. Where the eye of the mind gets really bogged down in a morass of ignorance, dialectic gently pulls it out and leads it. So the Socratic method of asking questions. What do you mean? And then you give an answer and they say, what do you mean by that? And what do you mean by meaning? The contribution of philosophy is actually the same in every generation. That's why the answers that came before, are still relevant. And it is to foster an individual's interrogation, and that includes every one of you, of your own, and in particular our cultural that By that I mean the assumptions that come from us, that we come almost with our mother's milk. The kind of things that are assumed in your family, in your high school, in your university. And we normally are not aware of that unless we interrogate it. And Drury believed that a medical education and practice, for example, is not exhausted by the accumulation of information and experience, particularly information. It's not a question of learning about every drug and every bodily organ and about the interaction thereof. It requires something more. The willingness to question medical practice in terms of the values espoused in its performance. In other words, to ask questions about the questions that medicine asks. Because a doctor coming into his consulting rooms brings with it the kind of a suite of assumptions and questions, but maybe he's not asking the right questions. I once asked, I have an uncle, he's now dead, but he was a farmer. And I used to spend a lot of time with him on the farm. And much later I asked him, do you think I would have made a good farmer? And he said, no. And I said, why? I said, why? And he said, you were asking the wrong questions when you were aged 5. You have to ask the right questions to be a good farmer. You have to ask the right questions to be a good doctor. And to ask these questions is a philosophical interrogation. Now you will notice that in the excerpt from the laws, which we read about the state's invalids, Plato commends the freeman's doctor, who constructs an empirical case history by consulting the invalid and his friends. In this way, he himself learns something from the sick, and at the same time he gives the individual patient all the instruction he can. In commending this approach, Plato the philosopher is referencing a fundamental medical institution, the clinical interview, the formal conversation between doctor and patients. And evidence of its Greek origins can be found in the very words we still use to describe the phases of that interview. You have that down here now. Taking a history. The Greek for that is anamnesis, which is the very medical practice singled out by Plato as characteristic of and worthy of a free man. Attentive listening to the patient's story / narrative. I note the emphasis placed on this phase by Gwande and Sanders, and it appears in Drury too, and indeed it is the case that the dialogue between doctor and patient plays an especially central healing role in Drury's specialty, psychiatry. Much more important than the pills. The second is an examination using, in addition to hearing, the senses of sight and touch. So you go on the couch and he uses his fingers, his hands, to help him to construct an empirical case history. Greek medicine at its apogee, which best in the Greek doctor Galen of Pergamon, which is Turkey, he practiced in Rome, was characterized by the recording of clinical histories for comparison's sake. Later on, with the invention of the stethoscope in 1826, the range of such examinations are considerably increased, and of course is now later augmented by comprehensive laboratory tests, to the extent, however, as Gwande claims, that testing has overwhelmed medical systems. It's all about testing. Thirdly, in the medical interview is a diagnosis using anatomical and with the development of history of medicine, physiological and pathological models. Modern medicine reliant on such medicines can be dated to 1858 with the publication of the book by Rudolf Virchow called Cellular Pathology. However, I note Professor Sanders' view. I saw that what I thought of as diagnosis was wrong much of the time, or for the most exciting parts in any case. I found that diagnosis was not the multiplication tables or the application of an algorithm, but more like Sherlock Holmes. This insight faces us with the presence of uncertainty in medical investigation, which means that it can never be simply applying an algorithm. That view is reinforced by similar insights into scientific investigation itself, even stretching to the level of quantum physics, and I think I mentioned a book last day that does that. Fourthly, there's a prognosis, again a Greek word, and a preferred method of treatment. The goal of the clinical interview is to arrive at a medical procedure that will lead the embodied being, very important in philosophy, the embodied being, not a defective machine. And that's, of course, where the problem comes. We can understand machines much better than we can understand human beings. To be restored to health. The World Health Organization described that as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Now, with that context sketched, I want to see how I'm doing for time. I am now in a position to relate more of Drury's biography, highlighting in particular a letter where Wittgenstein instructs Drury, now a medical student, along lines which are strikingly congruent with Plato's critique of current medical practice. Drury was born in Wiltshire in UK in 1907, and as I said, both his parents were Irish-born, but Anglican Christians, that's to say, members of the Church of England. And after his retirement to Exeter in Devon, Con Drury went to the grammar school there. While still at that high school, that's the modern equivalent of a grammar school, he went up to Trinity College in Cambridge in 1926 to study what was then called the moral sciences, as I mentioned. That's philosophy, with a long-term plan to take Anglican orders. In Drury's third year at Trinity College in Cambridge, Ludwig Wittgenstein returned to Cambridge, where he had studied under Bertrand Russell, as we all mentioned the last day, for some years before the First World War to teach philosophy. He was immediately fell under Wittgenstein's spell, and thereafter almost all the vocational decisions in his life were strongly influenced, if not dominated, by his teacher. Hence, although he resisted Wittgenstein's counsel to abandon his plan to enroll in the Anglican Theological College at Cambridge, Westcott House, because Wittgenstein claimed that clerical colour would choke you. Drury left the seminary after a year, in fact. And then he followed Wittgenstein's advice to live among ordinary people. Wittgenstein was very strongly Wittgenstein himself had come from probably the richest family in Austria, and he gave away all his, after returning from the First World War, he gave away all his money to his brothers and sisters. And thereafter he lived very, very frugally. And you have mentioned last day the number of different kind of things he tried. School teaching, gardening, architecture, God knows. But anyway, in Drury's case, he was involved in schemes to assist the vast number of unemployed people in Britain following the worldwide economic depression of the 1930s, which of course affected life here in America as well. And Wittgenstein's advice was that such voluntary work would be an antidote to the too narrow confines of Drury's middle-class English society, which was still affected by Victorian manners, very, very proper. Wittgenstein frequently expressed the view that teaching philosophy, what he was doing himself, was a ridiculous profession. And so he was pleased when Drury failed to be appointed to an academic post in philosophy when he applied for one about this time. A little later, Wittgenstein intervened when Drury, who was still needing to settle on a career, was so moved by the plight of a fellow worker who had suffered a mental breakdown that he wrote to Wittgenstein that he was considering becoming a psychiatric nurse. Wittgenstein immediately suggested that in view of his level of education, Drury should instead enroll in a medical school. Drury said, "But I don't have the money." Wittgenstein then went to his friend Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, who spent every morning in bed until 12 o'clock playing the stock market on his telephone. And Keynes came up with the cash. They then settled on the medical school at Trinity College in Dublin, a very old medical school founded in 1711, maybe slightly before Yale itself was founded. And mainly on the basis that the fees there were the cheapest they could find. And Dublin, of course, was Drury's father's native city. During the course of Drury's medical studies, Wittgenstein visited him in Dublin several times, and I will return to an incident that happened during one of these visits later on. At one stage, Wittgenstein asked Drury to inquire of his tutor at Trinity College Dublin whether Wittgenstein might join him there to study medicine. A request that, not surprisingly, was greeted with astonishment. It'd be like a Yale professor applying to some medical school in New York, Columbia maybe, and saying, "Can I join? Can I become a doctor?" It's extraordinary. The plan came to nothing, but then Wittgenstein also was thinking of going to Russia and studying medicine there. And you have to understand that in that case, in that environment in Oxford, Cambridge, in the 1930s, Marxism was very, very popular, and a lot of the people there were communists and actually eventually proved to be spies during the Second World War. They thought that Russia represented the future, socialist Russia. Here we are. See, if you could pass that down, do you mind? Could you pass it down, please? So, anyway, Drury was quite happy with the scientific studies and became first in his class, studying physiology and biology and all that. But when he moved into the clinical phase of his medical education, he suffered a vocational crisis. I can guarantee that you're going to suffer a vocational crisis at some stage of your life, maybe several of them. I can tell you that for nothing. I've been teaching students your age for 40 years, and some of the most creative and best are the people that change their minds. Anyway, Drury was very despondent, very down in the dumps, and Wittgenstein wrote him a letter. And this letter is the only I archived all his writings, and everybody, they've come from all over the world to Limerick where I live, and they're all expected in the archive they're going to find letters that Wittgenstein wrote to Drury. And we know that he wrote many of them, and there's only one that survives. And I swear to God, I'm not concealing anything. There's only one. And Dear Drury, I have thought a fair amount about our conversation on Sunday, and I would like to say, or rather not to say, but write a few things about these conversations. Mainly I think this: don't think about yourself, but think about others. For example, your patients. You said in the Phoenix Park, that's the big park in Dublin, yesterday, where they spent a lot of time walking, that possibly you made a mistake having taken up medicine. You immediately added that probably it was wrong to think such a thing at all. I am sure it is. But not because being a doctor you may not, not because being a doctor you may not go the wrong way or go to the dogs, but because if you do, this has nothing to do with your choice of a profession being a mistake. For what human being can say what would have been the right thing if this is the wrong one? You didn't make a mistake because there was nothing at the time you knew or ought to have known that you overlooked. You did your best. Only this could have been called making a mistake. And even if you made a mistake in this sense, this would now have to be regarded as datum, as all the other circumstances inside and outside, which you can't alter. The thing now is to live in the world in which you are, not to think of or dream about the world you would like to be in. Look at people's sufferings, physical and mental. You have them close at hand, and this ought to be a good remedy for your troubles. Another way is to take a rest whenever you ought to take one and collect yourself. Not with me, because I wouldn't rest you. As to religious thoughts, I do not think the craving for placidity is religious, which is often how religion is sold. Something one ought to hunt after. Look at your patients more closely as human beings in trouble, and enjoy more the opportunity you have to say good night to many people. This alone is a gift from heaven, which many people would envy you. And this sort of thing ought to heal you, and heal your frayed soul, I believe. It won't rest it, but when you are healthily tired, you can just take a rest. I think in some sense you don't look at people's face, the window of the soul, closely enough. In conversations with me, don't so much try to have the conversations which you think would taste well, though you will never get that anyway, but try to have the conversations which will have the pleasantest aftertaste. It is most important that we should not one day have to tell ourselves that we had wasted the time we were allowed to spend together. I wish you good thoughts, but chiefly good feelings. For my part, I see many echoes here of Plato's contrast between medical care, worthy of a free man, and his implied criticism of the kind of doctor who never gives any account of the particular illness of the individual slave, or is prepared to listen to one, but simply prescribes what he thinks best in the light of experience, as if he had precise knowledge and with the self-confidence of a dictator. That's the end of the quote from Plato. Immediately after the war, after the graduating, Drury joined the Royal Army Medical Corps, and he had a pretty rough time. He had an easy time in Egypt, in Cairo, but afterwards he followed in a tented hospital the advance of the army. He was landed on the beaches at Normandy, and then followed the advance of the army, the British army, across northern France and into Holland, and then the Battle of the Bulge, in which American soldiers distinguished themselves greatly. And he was in a tented hospital, and it was rough going. He returned to Dublin after the war, after 5 years of service. During the war, Wittgenstein himself worked, even though he was professor of philosophy in Cambridge, he went up there a day or two a week. But for the rest, he worked in Guy's Hospital in London as a porter and a pharmaceutical assistant, which meant he went around the wards bringing the medicines. And then he got involved in a research project regarding shock. Shock that came to people after they had the bombing in London, really. I mean, I can think of the same thing in Kiev at the moment, and Ukraine generally. You know, that it does leave huge marks on the people who have been bombed. And anyway, he never really settled in philosophy after that point, and eventually he decided that there was a book in him that he wanted to write in the 1930s, the book which he never finished but was published posthumously as the Philosophical Investigations. This is Wittgenstein. And so that there were two men in crisis. And eventually Drury secured a 6-month contract in St. Patrick's Philosophical Hospital, Psychiatric Hospital in Dublin, which was actually founded by Jonathan Swift, the writer of Gulliver's Travels. And he actually stuck with psychiatry and stayed there until he retired with cardiac-related symptoms. He died on Christmas Day, 1976. That's Drury. So Wittgenstein, after retiring, decided, will I go to Norway where he had a hut on a fjord, or will I go to Ireland? He came back to Ireland, and while there he got a very, very severe he became very severely mentally ill, and he was referred by Drury to Drury's boss, Professor Norman Moore. Again, we don't know an awful lot about what the problem was, but eventually he went to the wildest part of Ireland, Connemara, and to a cottage that Drury's elder brother had there. Wittgenstein died of prostatic cancer in 1951 in the home of a medical friend of Drury's, Dr. Bevan, in Cambridge. Now, at the beginning I quoted from Plato, and I want to quote from Drury and about an event which took place a good deal earlier in Dublin in 1936. Drury recalled, when I was a medical student here in Dublin and Wittgenstein came over to visit me, he wanted to give talks with some mental patients. I arranged for him to go to St. Patrick's Hospital, that's the psychiatric hospital, as a visit whenever he wanted to. There was one old man who had been in the hospital for many years, and Wittgenstein said about him, he was much more intelligent than his doctors. This man had read a lot of Herbert Spencer, that's the evolutionary theorist. And one day when he was having a discussion with Wittgenstein, I was there too. And I attempted to join in with some rather shallow logical positivism, which was the then fashionable philosophy in England, further to a book by A.J. Ayer, which actually summarized trends in philosophy which had developed in Vienna, Wittgenstein's home city, and very much influenced by Wittgenstein, but Wittgenstein never ever agreed that anybody could speak for him. So Wittgenstein told me to shut up when Drury intervened in this discussion with the patient. Later, when he was talking about it on our own, he said, when you are playing ping pong, you shouldn't use a tennis racket. In other words, be sensitive. Now, amazingly, Albert Camus, have you ever heard of him? A French writer, philosopher, extremely interesting man as well. He tells a very similar story, but it has an interesting twist in it. Let me get it here. He said, in a psychiatric hospital, a passing doctor noticed one of his patients fishing with a rod in a bathtub. Imagine it. As he walked by, mindful of this indispensable partnership between two human beings, the doctor asked the patient, are they biting the fish in the bathtub? To which the patient replied, idiot, can't you even see that it is a bathtub? So, yeah, no, I have stressed very much that this all depends on the store of experience and the examined life that a doctor brings to his patients. And by experience, I think I can't do better than quote from one of Wittgenstein's favorite novelists, Dostoevsky, in The Brothers Karamazov. It was said by many people about the elder Zosima that by permitting everyone for so many years to come to bare their souls and hearts and beg his advice and healing words, he had absorbed so many secrets, sorrows, and avowals into his soul that in the end he had acquired so fine a perception that he could tell at the first glance from the face of a stranger what he had come for, what he wanted, and what kind of torment racked his conscience. Wittgenstein assured Drury, yes, there really have been people like that. And indeed I believe there are doctors and other health professionals who can read their patients, as it were, at a glance. But unfortunately, this is a facility which is feigned and it's absented in the slave doctor who briskly proceeds from bed to bed and pretends he can read the patient like that. But there are people who can read, can zoom in straight away. No. Will I go on for just a few more minutes? I mentioned earlier that Drury collected in The Danger of Words a number of papers he had originally given, mainly to groups of doctors, as an illustration of the influence that Wittgenstein had on him. I notice here references to problems, practical difficulty, and perplexity. I haven't given you the full quotation. By way of introduction to another facet of the relationship between philosophy and medicine that is much more problematic than we have discussed so far. That concerns the role of scientific investigation in medicine, and that too had definite, albeit not exclusive, origins in certain philosophical trends. It's because of the philosophy of the physics that where they decided that there were four elementary substances that go to make up the world: earth, air, fire, and water. This was reflected in the body, in 4 elementary bodily fluids: phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and blood, all in dynamic balance. And well into the 19th century, the medical practice of bloodletting was justified on the pretext of restoring the bodily fluids. That if you had kind of I'm putting a flushed face, you should some blood would be drawn by leeches, little animals. So this was actually in contravention of what the Greek idea of medicine was, which was that one should rely mainly on the natural powers of the body to heal. And as is obvious, this power lies outside the direct control of the doctor. The Greek philosophers saw a similarity in that respect with their own art, which was teaching. At the last resort, the power to learn does not lie with the teacher, no more than the power to heal with the doctor. I can't make you learn anything, can I? But you do learn. You learn because you want to learn. And in a certain sense, what they were saying is you can rely on the body to heal, and as well, so I can rely on your intelligence to learn. And nature is the primary healer. At least that was the Greek conviction. And a very important German philosopher of medicine called Hans-Georg Gadamer characterized healing as enigmatic on that account. And perhaps we can apply the synonyms: difficult to interpret, mysterious even, to amplify what Drury was getting at. Now, I was going to talk to you a bit about interventionist medicine and trace it back to Francis Bacon and also to Descartes, but I think you've probably heard a lot about that. But basically, these guys said, intervene, 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 get involved. They all admitted that the current science got you nowhere, but it had a huge promissory value. And health would become the foundation of all the other blessings in this life, said Bacon. And what they were looking for was a cure for incurable diseases, the enhancement of human capacity, the prolonging of life even. And these are still things we're at. And these promissory notes were taken up over time in the universities, whereas now I think the medical faculties have a primacy far, far greater than the arts and humanities faculties. That's what's happened. Now, this kind of philosophical reflection, privileging science, has had many consequences for medicine. The doctor or medical researcher are portrayed as dealing with the body only, often modeled on a machine, such that machine is an extension of engineering, with the brain modeled on the computer, software to hardware. But there's always the feeling there's something more, a more that features inescapably in the interpersonal negotiation that is the ancient and venerable medical interview. Wittgenstein entered into this debate, and in his earlier book, he ends with, whereof one cannot speak, therefore one must be silent. You can speak science, but the other things about which you cannot speak, the appreciation of beauty in aesthetics, the values that ought to be exemplified in one's behavior, in ethics, the wonder at the very existence of the world, mysticism. In these cases, all you can do, he said at that point, is look and point. Look at that. Feel that. That matters. Later on, he modified that somewhat with the notion of language games, but he was against, which we've discussed last day, scientism. I'm coming to an end. I'm sure he was influenced in his own criticism of science. And remember, he started out life as an engineer. By his own experience of the mechanized slaughter in the trenches of the First World War, the industrial scale extermination of the Jews, a heritage he could claim as his own under the Nazis, and after 1945, the nuclear threat that still hangs over mankind with Mr. Putin. And all these are examples of the abuse of science unforeseen by Descartes or Bacon. So, put it this way, Wittgenstein and Drury picked this up, was an anti-Cartesian, seeing a huge separation between mind and body. We are embodied beings. And never can the two be separated. And they're separated only at their separation gives an entree into science into areas where it shouldn't go and can't go. Nevertheless, Drury and with Wittgenstein's approval were welcomed the use of pharmacology in psychiatry, which happened in the 1950s, I suppose. But Wittgenstein warned, don't let yourself think that all human problems can be solved in this way. They can't. Although our intelligence and our willpower are dependent on the proper functioning of a very complicated and delicate neurohumoral mechanism over which we have no control, our sanity is at the mercy of a molecule, but that does not mean that all the answers lie on that level of analysis. In mental illness, Drury stressed the terrifying loneliness of the experience of mental illness. But he said a loneliness that can make the sufferer more aware of the mysteriousness of our present being. Indeed, the patient may thereby gain insights not yet appreciated by his medical carer. As Wittgenstein remarked to the patient in St. Patrick's Hospital, I think this man is much more intelligent than any of his doctors. In sum, mental illness can make the enigma of each person apparent not only to the sufferer, but for those who care for him or her, especially, perhaps the medical carer. And it is because of that enigma, with its attendant uncertainty, that medical practice continues to be as much an art as it is a science. This art can only be mastered by an onerous apprenticeship, such as Drury experienced. Through that apprenticeship, the doctor learns when to intervene using valuable scientific resources and when to let nature take its healing course. This discrimination is especially important when the doctor faces his or her last task, the palliative one of conducting the patient to the gates of the unknown at our death. Thank you.